Thank you so much, Adam. Now the floor is open for comments.
Thank you. Thanks very much for excellent presentation. The question I have for you is on the political economy effects of what you're saying, and I'm thinking of three dimensions. One is like we've seen many structural transformations of the economy, especially over the last few decades, but this one is different given the power and potential profits of the fossil fuel companies that they are unwilling to forsake, and they will do whatever it takes to stop that transition. The second political economy issue is when you try to properly price carbon emissions, you get massive backlashes. Yellow vests in France, recently in Ecuador. There just seems to be no way out of that. And the third, you mentioned the heat stresses affecting the countries they're affecting is going to cause massive climate refugees, and these refugees are not going to be welcomed into these countries. They will fuel demagogues and nationalists and all kinds of stuff, as you know. So I mean, the political economy picture to me sounds like a huge obstacle to this kind of transition that you're trying to get. Just wanted to get your views on that.
Yes, thank you very much. Very, very important question. And yes, the transitioning to a sustainable economy is very much a political issue. The science is there. I mean, it can be done. But a lot of it does rest on what you said before. It could be the lobbying position of certain firms that are able to convince, well, there's two things. One is to convince governments or lobby and manage to withdraw this pressure to transition. Another one is globalization, which means that we essentially have a public good that is shared across the world, and if some countries are going to transition and perhaps bear higher production costs at the start, they may very well become uncompetitive in the global market. So that also might play a role in government policy. But regarding heat stress, migration it does hold the potential to cause some sort of social unrest, especially if there's a perception that, which unfortunately tends to be the case, that people are coming and stealing jobs, or people feel that social security systems are unable to absorb the new labour influx, or worker influx. I do think, though, that this requires supranational level coordination, and I think it's a very political issue, and there really has to be more focus on, I think, the economics of it and just this general sustainability, I think. Thank you.
Okay, Adam, I would also like to thank you very much for your presentation. I've got one more broad question and the other is more specific. The more broad one is just very close to what Anthony mentioned. I think we all would agree that greening the economy is necessary, but of course the how that makes a difference. Is there any kind of best practice from your international comparisons and international experience regarding this issue? And my more specific question is related. You were presenting findings on the impacts of transition favoring the environment, and how do you put the transition into the model, into your model? As far as I have learned, this is a kind of an economic model, and the question is here, how will countries deal with the transition? What do you use, what kind of assumptions do you use regarding the speed of transition or regarding the measures you were putting into the model? So this is more specific, but I would be very much interested.
Well, to start with the last one. So I was not sure what degree of technicality to provide to this crowd or audience, but for the WESO, we used an input-output table approach, and we created several scenarios. And in this scenario, we tried to obey or be true to the Paris Agreement, the 2% projection in climate change. But regarding the numbers, a lot of it is based on a bunch of assumptions between substitution. For example, if we have the birth of a new industry, how likely is it that we can what proportion is likely to go from the carbon-based alternative to the sustainable renewable alternative? Very much, I'm not sure how familiar you are with input-output tables, but there's a lot of restrictive assumptions. But for one, it's based on, not future prices. But yes, so just scenarios, I would say. And the first question, so how do we transition to a sustainable economy? Well, that is a very, very tough question. I must say, I know more from the labour aspect. I'm not sure about shifting production systems and such. So maybe I'm not the best person to answer that question. Thanks.
Beatriz? The microphone.
Sorry, thank you. Well, thank you for an excellent presentation. First, I want to highlight a very important point you made, which is also made in other presentations, and particularly it's made very strongly in the presentation of Marco Bentivogli, which is the General Secretary of the Italian Federation of Metal Workers, which is without skills development, there is not just transition, but not only regarding the green economy, regarding the future of work. I mean, this is this is the main message, and you're saying that even in a transition to a green economy, there is going to be job destruction, there's going to be massive worker transitions, there's going to be reallocation, and then, but the net effect will be an increase in net jobs. So, and this is also what is going to happen because of technological change in the context of the future of work. So we're going to see technology and transition to a green economy will mean massive workers' transition in the years ahead. So we have to be aware of this, and we have to try at the international and national level to implement the policies and initiatives necessary to ease and facilitate worker transitions to make this transition just. So that's the point. And one comment, small comment, when you mention structural drivers, you mention aging. Aging is a problem, is not yet a world problem. In areas where you need also to care about a just transition, like in Africa, or in areas where you need the green transition, like the Middle East, the challenge is the youth population. The youth population is very large and increasing. So aging, it's a European problem, it's China, it's the United States, it's still not everywhere. In other areas, you still have a demographic dividend. The question is, you mentioned, well, ILO is going to support a number of economies in developing a plan for a green transition and increasing jobs. The key problem developing economies are facing is access to finance. So is there anything proposed at the international level, at least not regarding supporting companies to go into the green transition, but supporting easing workers' transition? Are you planning, is ILO requesting for any cooperation on this regard for countries who devise a plan in this regard? So my question is how cooperation will require international cooperation will require funding. Where does the funding will come from?
Thank you very much. A couple of very interesting points. And I agree, youth bulges are certainly an issue. As far as maybe continent averages go, maybe Africa is the only continent that's not seeing an aging population at the moment, but that's projected to stabilize, well, not stabilize, that's projected to go up by 2030, I believe, or 2030. But regarding the credit, yes, of course, that's a massive, massive issue. The ILO, as a specialized UN agency, they're more about providing expert advice than actually distributing credit. For such programs that perhaps that can go through the World Bank or the IMF, but I know the ILO, they don't actually do any of that sort of work. But I agree, it's a very pressing issue, and of course without the capital or the finance, it's very hard to enable such a transition. And at the same time, I mean, there is an equity argument where many argue that industrialized countries, you know, they benefited from using what we call brown energy or carbon-based energy, and it's almost unfair to impose a green transition to developing countries or in other words, they don't get the same benefit as we did. So that is also a pressing issue. But I must say the finance is a massive, important issue, and there should be more allocated.
Thank you, Adam. Thank you for your presentation. Now, ILO is an important organization. Of course, you are in the initial stage of your profession there, but I'm sure that you can give an impulse to your general directors and to the following effect. As you know, being yourself an economist, a major aporia of economic science is that of using only static and dynamic comparative analysis and not traverse analysis. Traverse analysis is the expression introduced many years ago by John Hicks, famous Nobel Prize winner. The fact is that apart for few exceptions, we never carrying on traverse analysis. Traverse analysis means that it's not enough to say that the new social and economic equilibrium is superior in the Pareto sense to the previous one. You have to consider the cost of transition, because transitions can be effective in few years or in many years. And during the transition, the lives of people are involved. My question is, why ILO never started, just because it's not a pure academic institution, so it's freer, to start with a traverse analysis? Because it's not enough to say that the green transition will generate more jobs, but more jobs for whom? And if it takes, for instance, 10 years, can we wait 10 years before offering a job to somebody who, coming from the previous equilibrium, has lost it? We cannot. So it seems to me that unless we start with a serious traverse analysis, all our proposals will be ineffective. Because people will say, I know that the new equilibrium is superior, but how do we get there? And it is not enough to say, during the traverse, we offer money to the people. That is ridiculous. That is against the dignity of work. Because you cannot say, that person, that group is being displaced, and in order not to starve, we offer you a salary or a payment or regular time. So why in your organization there is no such a sense of, can you tell us something? Thank you.
Well, I agree. It would be reckless to just aimlessly throw money around and hope for some miracle transition. I agree. But along with having the finance or the capacity to actually to shift production systems to a renewable, in a renewable manner, it's of course important to train the workforce. I don't mean just we don't mean just providing social protection to those displaced and kind of put them aside. The idea is people will be hurt and they will lose their jobs. So during the transition process, it's necessary that they don't fall through the net. There should be some sort of safety net. But in tandem with that, there should also be some sort of skills development policy to also make them competitive, make them mobile and able to reach new high-skilled jobs, which promotes decent work. High-skilled jobs typically have better working conditions than low-skilled jobs. But regarding the theoretical premise of why the research isn't in that direction, maybe you hit the nail on the head at this initial stage of my career, maybe I don't know.
Jeffrey?
Thank you very much. I agree with your conclusions about the net job creation from this transition, and also want to say that I think we should not, the transition from a carbon-based energy system to a zero-carbon energy system is a big deal, but it is not a tumultuous change for most of society. For most of society, we turn on the light, and whether the light is powered by a coal plant or wind turbine or solar plant is of complete ignorance and irrelevance to most of us. We would all be hard-pressed to say what is powering this room this morning, and we generally wouldn't care. How our vehicles are driven, whether they are driven by battery or internal combustion engine, is of almost no concern to most of us who don't understand what happens under the hood anyway. We want to get there. The electric cars are more silent, less noisy, and actually will be better vehicles to drive. The changes that will be involved involve specific, rather narrow classes of work. Miners, for example, coal miners, which is in general a quite horrible profession because it claims lives, it is very deadly. You would not want your child, I would not want mine going down in a coal mine. These have been jobs of desperation for many people. Of course, oil rig workers and so on. In the United States, to give you an idea, there are only 20,000 coal miners remaining in a workforce of 150 million people. This is not, therefore, really in any way a central issue. A real issue is that the former coal mining regions need employment, and they are in general faded regions that have been environmentally destroyed, and there are not new jobs that have come into that declining industry for a long time. So there's a social and regional policy, but the direct impacts of jobs is modest and probably, or almost surely, net positive. The reason for engaging in the transition, of course, is not about jobs. It's about saving Earth and saving all of society. And the job issue is pertinent but not a central issue. In terms of the transition costs, those are also likely to be modest relative to the size of our economies. The basic transition that we need is to green electricity, wind, solar, hydro, geothermal power, ocean power, away from coal, oil, and gas. It's away from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles, away from diesel to synthetic fuels. None of this seems to be beyond basic financial means. None of it seems to be above 1% of the output of any of our economies. Even making the full transition, for example, to electric vehicles from internal combustion engine vehicles. This is just not crushing economically. The problem is actually a practical one about Pareto improvement, the idea that everybody is better off. What the losers of this definitely are the owners of the fossil fuels. That is both from a country point of view and an industrial and wealth point of view. We do not aim to, I think, and do not feel ethically any responsibility to compensate ExxonMobil for the substitution away from the industry. In fact, on the contrary, I would like to tax the remaining income and wealth of ExxonMobil to help pay for the transition. That's an industry that has known at the top levels about the dangers of what they do for 40 years and have faked it. So I don't think that the property rights belong with them and that we have to bribe them or make them better off. But that brings in the politics. This is a real struggle for politics. We have more votes than they do, and they have more money than we do. And this has been a large part of the difficulty of movement because most oil countries are corrupt in the sense that the oil wealth pays for the politics. This is true in the United States, it's true in Canada, it's true in Australia, it's true in Russia, it's true in Saudi Arabia. It's true in general because oil wealth is very easily transferred into political power. It's true in Nigeria and so on. So this is the real challenge, actually. We're not aiming for Pareto optimality. We're aiming to tax a very powerful sector and actually close it down. It's not the workers primarily who will suffer from that, as those who have benefited from 100 years of political power of being the major oil and gas interests. That's the struggle. Maybe if we were Pareto optimizing or Pareto improving and we were giving massive wealth to Exxon and to Mohammed bin Salman and to Putin and others, we'd have an easier political transition. It just seems so implausible and distasteful to view the ethics of this transformation in that manner. So I think that I wanted to put this in perspective. I do not regard personally, from everything that I've seen, the hundreds of studies that have been done, the difficulty of the transition from an economic, financial, sectoral, or employment perspective to be our main challenge. I regard this mainly as an awareness and political challenge to get organized to undertake what we need to do. Having said that, let me just add, if you are in a heavy coal, oil, or gas region in the Gulf, in the Kremlin, in the Senate of the United States, in West Virginia, you don't feel that way. Those are not the predominant places where people live and work in the world. They're a tiny, tiny part of the world, but they're highly concentrated and highly motivated to fight for their interests. When it comes to the workers and the communities, I'm all for compensation. When it comes to the power structure, I'm all for political struggle. But we have to win the battle.
I would like to add just one comment. What you just said is that we have to be prepared for more challenges because the traditional oil and gas industries are the taxpayers, and those companies are owned by pension funds and mutual funds, savings of the people, while the new industries are usually users and recipients of the public funds. So when we take into consideration this transition, we have to make sure that we don't overhaul the overall balance.
I would propose, I mean, there are issues, but in general, I would like to tax the wealth of the oil and gas industry so that it is not earned by the big wealth owners, and use those proceeds to fully fund pension funds, to fund the pensions of workers, and to fund the just transition of communities. What I don't want to see is ExxonMobil pay out its wealth in large dividends to predominantly very wealthy people. and then leave the pension funds empty, leave the communities desolate. And so I think the struggle is even harder because I wouldn't leave Exxon well capitalized for the sake of benefits of pension funds, because the biggest beneficiaries will be very wealthy owners of the shares, because equity ownership is not democratically owned. It is incredibly concentrated in ownership.
Yes, this is why I am saying that the share price is a function of the dividend stream. So if we cut back the dividend, then the share price will fall, then the savings of those pensioners will decrease. So there should be a very sophisticated solution for this, because the wealthy people who get the dividend, they invest that money somewhere, either into museums or working capital somewhere. So when we shake the overall balance, we have to be very careful not to harm the innocent people, the savers.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you for a very interesting presentation and for the discussion. I think we're coming to the point that we came to at the end of the previous session, that it's really a political process that we're talking about here. And I think political in the more general sense, and Professor Donati was right to correct me that that we need to separate the political structures from the sense of political process in general. And precisely because we do have that difference, I'd like to ask a question maybe to everybody who's here, but I suppose especially to our speaker and to Jeffrey. You know, Stefano's often talked about the meeting in 1974 in Rambouillet, where we had the decisions which led to the first big phase of globalization, and we saw there the beginnings of the economic market taking over as a sort of the central social model to control all other models. And now we have the situation where all politicians are judged on how much their policies increase GDP, on you know, a series of economic indicators, and not on much else, really. So what we have is that the economics is the queen of the sciences, if we like now, or the queen of the practice anyway, and the politicians have to adapt themselves to the economic situation instead of it being the other way around. So coming back a bit to your point that you raised, Janos, about transition. We have now, in this situation of globalization, which of course has a lot of benefits, it's not all negative in any way, but we have these very big international economic players. They are not subject to the international system of human rights. They cannot be taken to court for their not respecting human rights, although there's a big process now, as we know, to try and get national jurisdictions to incorporate human rights provisions in their national law so they can be taken to court in another way. But still, they are major international actors without any international subjectivity, according to international law. And so I think my question really is, how do we think about this transition to green, this transition of dealing with work in this very, very febrile atmosphere that we're in and changing a lot, in a way that puts the political at the center, but which also recognizes that we have these very, very big economic actors, not primarily political actors, who nevertheless have major political power, informally anyway. How do we get them into the system in the sense of what Janos was saying, in the sense of a transition? I think we would want to transition to a situation, as the Church's social teaching is saying, of having some kind of very, very explosive phrase, but we could call it what we want, a world authority, some kind of system of overall governance, which gives the primacy back to the political and with all the proper legitimacy, with all the proper representation of people, you know, none of which exists with these big economic players. But we need to get there. We need to get there in the context of this very difficult situation that we are in now. So I'd be interested in anybody's comments about how to deal with the big multinationals with regard to work and the green transition, and to bringing back the political to the centre of our discussion.
I wanted to say something else about greening the economy, but maybe I can say something about my experience with multinationals, because I've been working on multinationals activities in developing countries for the past 15 years. And just what you say, Elena, reminds me of discussions we had just last week, because I'm a member of the stakeholder committee of Michelin, the tire company. I think it's the first tire company in the world. And it was interesting because we spent 1 day and a half, we were the executive committee of Michelin, all of them, with the CEO and the stakeholders members, discussing about the issues related to the tire industry and sustainability. And it was interesting, but there was somebody from the UN and somebody from Latin America Development Bank and other people. And in fact, it was interesting to see how they perceived the contradiction between their intention, which is how can Michelin be an actor really committed to sustainability, and well, the global competition that they have to face, the fact that the demographic criteria means that we need more cars in a way, and trucks and planes, or it's very difficult for them to promote a kind of cultural change in the way people relate to mobility. And we had very interesting discussions on these cultural changes. So for me, maybe a major challenge is not only political, of course it's political, but it's also cultural, because if we want citizens to be responsible and in all countries, because my experience that in developing countries you have the elites who have exactly the same kind of lifestyles as in our countries. We really need to change the way we imagine the good life, and we have to promote rather quality mobility, for example, if I take this example, than quantity. And these people were expressing the fact that, in fact, that the future is very uncertain, even for them, and that they can try to be influential in the way the sector deals with these mobility issues. And they were saying that, according to them, they have to promote a multi-stakeholder dialogue where they can try to have an active role and a kind of political advocacy role in order to change some regulations and to work with authorities at different scales in order to change the way we conceive development in territories. And saying that alone, of course, they are in this competition and they feel in a way helpless. But to see that the CEO and the person in charge of strategy was expressing the fact that they want to deal with the core, the root causes of the problems was interesting. And I had also with the former CEO a discussion where he says, for example, as far as the way the value is created and shared, that with accounting standards and this kind and taxation and fiscal optimization, that they could play, his perception was that the CEOs could play a bigger role in order to influence the regulation, in a way, in a rather different way than the lobbying that they generally exert. And maybe if I can, one thing about greening the economy. For me, the question is it only words? In fact, that if the greening the ecology, the objective, is it really up to the COP21 agreement? And then are there discussions about promoting sobriety or frugality? in, at least not for the poorest people, of course, but for medium class and upper class people in the world, and taking into account the economic constraints related to minerals and the fact that even to have a green electricity, we need minerals that are extracted with fossil fuels, so there's a kind of vicious circle. And in France, there have been several reports by people like Biwix or Pitron, I don't know whether they have been translated, if there are other surveys on this, who highlight the fact that, in fact, for them, we make hypotheses on the availability of the resources, and they say that it's inconsistent with the reality of the constraints for the entire economy. So I think this, I don't know whether if in the ILO reports this is taken into account.
Well, in which report? The WESO, the first one I discussed with the job creation and job destruction. No, I don't think that's taken into account broadly, but I do agree that it's a very important issue. I do.
We are running out of time, but we will have two final comments from Professor Donati and Professor Benanti.
A very, very short comment and a question. Adam, you said that the main drivers of change are governments, entrepreneurs, and workers. Now, I think that this is an old view of what happens, because as far as you have illustrated the ILO position, this means that the future is seen in terms of the binomial state and market, what I call the lib-lab arrangement of society. Now, the social doctrine is opposing that kind of arrangement of a society in which the liberal and labor, the market and the state, are the only two main actors leading society into the future. You have to consider the third sector and something which is outside the state market binomial. And this gets into the question of how to go beyond the political constitutions. The political constitutions of our political systems were created in the 19th century. They are very old. They are linked to the nation-state concept. Now, in a globalized time, we need very different constitutions. Günther Teubner, who is a German sociologist of law, talks about civil constitutions. And civil constitutions, beyond political constitutions, are precisely linked to what is outside of the binomial state and market. What do you think about that?
Yes, regarding heat stress, we, of course, said that the government, employers, and workers hold, a massive role, a huge role, in not only from a government perspective in setting up the regulation and institutional changes, but workers and employers to identify early stages of heat stress, I suppose. But regarding the WESO, or transitioning generally to a sustainable economy, this, of course, requires government and additional actors, but it also very much requires international agreements, and at least the enforcing as well as compliance to international agreements. But as I showed in maybe it was the early third or fourth slide, the ILO are having discussions on how to update their constitution, because I do agree, I mean, in the changing world, this is perhaps not fully outdated, but it could certainly be augmented.
Thank you very much. I simply would like to add the possibility to have a second perspective on that. I'm looking back at some PhD candidates that are working with me, and without forgetting the mitigation and the cost of mitigation in that social climate changing, we could also add a new dimension, that is the dimension of adaptation. That means that we could change the way in which also make work, and through technology that's really possible, to have an adaptation and to amplify the possibility of labor. And so, because a lot of companies now are embracing this idea that it's time to have not only a profit but also a purpose, that could be a really interesting section in which we can have a sort of contract with this kind of company to invest in an adaptation, some kind of technology that could mitigate the other effect. Thank you.